Hi, and welcome to the latest CIH podcast, where today we'll be talking about the housing market, exploring whether it's all bad news or if there are some glimmers of hope to cling on to. I'm really pleased to be joined by some of the UK Housing Review team who know their stuff on this. Our podcast panel today is made up of Peter Williams, Departmental Fellow at Cambridge University and a well-known expert on the private housing market, Bob Pannell, an economist and respected analyst of housing and mortgage markets, and last but not least, CIH's very own John Perry, who leads our work on the UK Housing Review, which, if you missed it, had its autumn briefing launch earlier this month and is a fantastic resource for all things housing. A very warm welcome to you all. Thanks for giving up your time today. So we're recording this podcast at a particularly challenging time for the housing market. Whether you rent or own, many people are feeling the pressure from rising housing and general living costs. Previous Chancellor's mini budget, which set out to boost economic growth, rather backfired, and we now look to be heading into a long recession. And all of this comes on the back of a global pandemic. But before we dive into the pressures of the here and now, can I start with a question to you first, Bob? And let's just look back slightly. How did the market and prospects for first-time buyers look coming out of the pandemic? Was it simply back to business as before?
Hi, Rachel. No, this is an answer in a few parts, I think. Immediately post-pandemic, the recovery was heavily influenced by both the race for space that we're all very familiar with, and also by the stamp duty holiday arrangements. First-time buyers were relatively disadvantaged by the stamp duty holiday, and a temporary spike in deposit requirements unwound as lenders' capacity and appetite to lend strengthened from late 2020 onwards. There was a sharp pickup in activity on all fronts, including first-time buyers, through the first half of 2021, but then things have subsequently eased back. There's been continuing house price pressures, but for most of the second half of 2021, we still saw very low mortgage rates, and that kept things very much continuing. Sales activity has settled down since turn of the year as cost of living and interest rate pressures have been.
Right, thanks, Bob. So that's describing a different world, certainly, from the one that we know now, isn't it? So how has that changed over the last month or so following the not so mini budget, and what were the main factors involved? Can I come to you, Peter?
Sure. Yes, I mean, it is clearly a complicated picture, and we obviously have to distinguish is what happens globally and what happens in the UK. Clearly, interest rates have been rising across the world, and there have been rising concerns about inflation across the world. But the mini budget clearly triggered a collapse in confidence in the UK gilt market, the bonds issued by the government. And that caused a rise in the effective interest rate on them. And those rates are used to price fixed rate mortgages. 80% of the market is fixed rate loans. And the upshot of that was a spike in mortgage rates, a withdrawal of products by lenders from the market, and indeed a cessation of lending by lenders. The market became unstable, uncontrollable in terms of price and product, and therefore there was a rapid contraction in the mortgage market in every sense. And that, of course, also fed through into the securitization market, which is where some loans are sold out to investors. There was a retreat from buying UK assets, which meant that lenders that rely on the securitization market to refinance and do more lending were unable to get asset sales away. So the combination of all of these things is a significantly damaged market in late October running into November. But of course, that's eased a little bit. Clearly, consumer confidence and other factors are still low. But I will go on, if you like, in the next question to say more about how it's recovered a little bit since.
Yeah, please do. I mean, let's try and find the optimism where it's there to be found. So where are those glimmers of hope with the latest market moves?
Yes, I mean, I think we've been through a fairly traumatic period in which everybody is feeling damaged and in which the mini budget is not just following global trends where there were specific factors around the UK which really were unhelpful. In terms of current prices, products and transactions, we have seen lenders return to the market. We have seen product prices edging down again as confidence in UK gilts, for example, has recovered a little. And we've seen a return of, to some degree, of higher LTV loans. So there's the beginnings of a sort of stabilization and improvement of the housing and mortgage markets, but we're clearly we're clearly moving to an era which is going to be different than the one we've had in the past. Rates are rising and will continue to rise, and we can expect issues to become more difficult. To give you an example, looking ahead, mortgage approvals. I mean, one of the problems we have with all of this is that the data that we have to work with is all backward looking. It's very hard to get a picture of today's market because all the data that's being issued is of yesterday's market or indeed a month ago's market. But mortgage approvals, for example, fell in September to 67,000. They were about 75,000 in August. And the rate paid has gone up. And it just highlights all of the problems we have in the lag data, that we don't have a picture really for October and November. The latest RICS survey, which is of confidence in the market, issued in October, that highlighted falling buyer inquiries, falling listings and falling sales, and price growth basically starting to fall, and significantly for everybody outside of the owner-occupied market, higher rents coming through. And the net balance, they take the view of estate agents, the net balance of views by estate agents was a minus 45% of the outlook in terms of where sales were going. And when you ask them to look ahead, they were down minus 40% over the next year. So clearly, not only is the current circumstance quite negative in terms of estate agents' views of the market, but looking ahead, their views are quite negative as well.
Yeah, so some really significant change that we're seeing there.
Yeah.
And of course, the next UK housing review next spring is going to really be able to reflect on some of that latest data,
Yes.
isn't it, and help us understand it
Yes.
better.
And I mean, just to add, I mean, Rightmove, for example, today, and their data is based on offer prices. In other words, at the beginning of the transaction, they have it down. The offer prices are down 1.1% in November, which they think, although there will be for this year, there'll be an annual rise of about 7.7%, so below inflation, and that is still better than the demand is still higher than it was in 2019, but it's lower than it was in 2021, and that's impacting. And I think Bob may want to add to this. It's impacting clearly on the numbers of first-time buyers and second home purchases. So it's the market is trending down.
Yeah, so why don't we come on to first-time buyers then from there? I know you've done a lot of work, Bob, looking at first-time buyers and particularly affordability and access to the market. I wonder if you can just share some of the work you've done to look at who the true first-time buyers are, what we're seeing coming through, and then perhaps within that, perhaps we can unpack a bit of the stamp duty changes that were introduced and whether they're having the intended impact.
Okay, very happy to. Yes, the thing about first-time buyers is that much of what we know comes from industry data, and we've known for quite a few years that definitions surrounding that are not as rigorous as, for example, with some official data. And the figures for reported first-time buyers, we know that they do include a proportion of households, people that are returning to home ownership, whether that's after a period of working abroad or temporarily living back with their parents, or perhaps following a relationship breakdown. But there will have been a gap in their home ownership, but they have previously been homeowners. And that makes a big difference, because people who are in that returners camp, they tend to be older, for obvious reasons. And they also tend to have higher incomes, and in many cases they will have some equity from a previous home ownership experience. And those are all characteristics which are much more consistent with or similar to those of movers. And that means when we're looking at metrics based on reported first-time buyers, they are potentially significantly distorted by relatively high proportions of those who previously owned earlier on. And it's not easy to get an accurate handle on numbers, but we can compare industry figures, for example, with the government's figures on stamp duty receipts. And in recent years, there has been something called first-time buyer relief, specifically for first-time buyers. And there is quite a rigorous definition that sits around that. So by doing a compare and contrast, we can get and doing things on a like-for-like basis, because the stamp duty relief only applies to England and Ireland. But doing things on a like-for-like basis, we do get some ability to compare industry first-time buyer numbers with those which have gone through perhaps subject to a much more rigorous and narrower definition. And that's suggested certainly pre-COVID that perhaps as many as a quarter of first-time buyers had some prior home ownership experience, and therefore likely to have different characteristics from true or genuine first-time buyers. And these can have quite significant distorting effects that routinely sort of are presented in the media. So, for example, the typical loan to value that a true first-time buyer might have is likely to be quite significantly higher than the routinely published industry metrics. So it could be as much as a difference between industry metrics might suggest that the typical LTV has been 75%. The actuality for true first-time buyers might be 10 percentage points higher than that. It might be more like 84, 85%. So it's quite significant distortions in the affordability constraints and characteristics that we associate with first-time buyers. And it's quite important. I suppose one of the other elements of this is that it's one of the developments really since the global crisis 12, 13 years ago, when lots of things changed about lending profile in terms of products that were no longer made available to borrow. Borrowers, first-time buyers, have seen less generous loan to values and been subject to much more rigorous deposit requirements. And much of the narrative over the last 10 years or so has been about the difficulty of first-time buyers putting together a sufficiently large deposit to get them on the housing market. House prices for much of the past 10 years or so have grown, and in recent years very substantially. And there's a sometimes difficult to square the circle. House price earnings ratios have risen significantly and now at or near record levels across much of the UK. But first-time buyers have continued to be in the market, and indeed their numbers have recovered over this decade quite significantly. A large part of the reason for that has been, until recently, the very low mortgage rates that have been experienced, but also an element has been that first-time buyers have come from ever higher income groups. And some of that is undoubtedly linked to the fact that reported first-time buyer numbers include some who've previously been home. So it's difficult to give a precise handle on all of this, but trying to understand how first-time buyers have stayed in the game for as long as they have does require a little bit of mental gymnastics to appreciate that some of these things are not always what they appear when you read the newspaper.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Bob. John, can I bring you in there? Did you have some thoughts on that?
Yes, Bob, I was just looking at some new work done by the Resolution Foundation, where they're looking at the extra costs that first-time buyers face. And I wondered if it's worthwhile thinking about first-time buyers in two different categories: ones that are awaiting to buy, and others that have just bought in the last couple of years when interest rates have been very low. Because the Resolution Foundation is arguing that the ones that have just bought in the last year or two now face double the lifetime costs for their mortgage because of the sudden growth in interest rates. So I wonder if we're in a situation where recent first-time buyers are going to be particularly vulnerable, particularly if their income doesn't keep pace with inflation, as well as the situation where new first-time buyers, are put off from entering the market because of high mortgage costs and poor income prospects. Is that a sort of fair assessment of the current situation as of this moment?
Thank you, John. A good question. I think it's always been the case that recent first-time buyers are very exposed, both in terms of what happens to their subsequent income and also what happens in the wider housing market and indeed the wider economy in terms of interest rates, because one of the characteristics of the UK is that even when people fix their mortgages, it tends to be for no more than 5 years, and that comes around surprisingly fast. So actually, first-time buyers, almost by definition, are taking a very highly leveraged gamble on both their own circumstances and that of the wider economy and the housing market remaining on a relatively even keel. Resolution Foundation do some fantastically good work, and it's undoubtedly the case that I think also in the context that there are question marks about what happens to house prices over the next 12-18 months, and I'm sure we'll go on to that, talk about that a bit later on. There is that vulnerability there, both in terms of the possibility that house prices might reduce, and of course those who may have come into the market very recently or are coming into the market now, potentially they are doing so at relatively elevated mortgage rates. So that does leave them facing those household financial pressures, those continuing at an elevated level for some time. Whether recent first-time buyers, those who bought perhaps post-pandemic at very competitive and prices chased up, whether they are more or less disadvantaged than those who are still hoping to come into the market over the next period, I think that's a bit more of a moot point. But it's undoubtedly the case there is always that the main risks around home ownership tend to be concentrated in the first few years of home ownership, that's for sure.
And if I may just add to Bob's narrative, I mean, in that process of first-time buyers entering the market, there's clearly been the significant impact of the Bank of Mum and Dad. And the Bank of Mum and Dad has supported, well, upwards of 25% of transactions, if not significantly more. But obviously the Bank of Mum and Dad is also coming under strain. So I think the upshot of all of the things Bob described and the Bank of Mum and Dad is it means the first time that the pressure on real first-time buyers, people entering at the lower ends of the market on lower incomes, does become much more serious than many people imagine, and that the market tends to talk it away, perhaps rather too easily.
That's really interesting, isn't it, Peter? Because I know obviously we're talking about potential drop-off in house prices, but until now, as we've said, if you've recently bought, you'd have been buying at the height of the market, you might have saved up an awful lot of money, helped perhaps by a gift or a loan from parents who might now, not be in a position to be able to give that support. You're looking at effectively, salary reduction when you look at the cost of living. And then you're potentially looking at negative equity coming around the corner with talk of prices dropping to quite significant amounts in different parts of the country. So a really worrying time, and certainly people are talking about the end of cheap money, aren't they? So that's, we're going to see some big implications. I'd be interested in people's thoughts then on the stamp duty element of the changes. That was almost one of the only elements that wasn't reversed from a housing perspective in the budget.
Shall I start off, Bob, and you come back in? I think stamp duty cuts, are politically useful because obviously they symbolise government's concern for first-time buyers, but they're not really as helpful in terms of the housing market as well. They ultimately become capitalised into prices. So there are, yes, individuals who gain from that cut at that moment, but over time, as the market starts to price up to take account of those cuts, the benefit erodes. And basically, stamp duty cuts ultimately pass the benefit to existing owners through higher house prices. So I think they disadvantage new entrants. They're short-term palliatives, responding to political and but also economic pressures, because the other thing they do is they cause a short-term stimulus to the housing market. So there are more transactions, more activity, more home improvement, etc., which of course can be a useful boost. And as the Chancellor is considering that for later this week, there may be a temptation to think, well, one way to quickly kickstart the UK economy is to engineer some kind of recovery in the housing market further than what's already anticipated.
Yeah, and Bob, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, well, firstly, I largely agree with what Peter has said. In fact, I think I agree with everything that Peter has said. Certainly, stamp duty is a government favourite. I think it almost reflects a misunderstanding about how the housing market works. It's quite clearly you can do something that prompts a short-term distortion in activity, but there is almost no evidence that a stamp duty cut adds to the totality of activity over any period of time. So it's entirely about distorting the pattern of activity rather than providing any genuine benefit. And I think also there is a difference between having a set of stamp duty arrangements that make some sense in a structural way. So, for example, I think there is a legitimate set of arguments that says that while we have stamp duty, there deserves to be a preferential treatment of genuine first-time buyers within that set of arrangements. And I can also understand why there is a sense that people buying second homes should be subject to higher rates of stamp duty, and indeed those who are buying from overseas in prime residential areas subject to a non-residential even higher imposition. So I mean there are arguments for having stamp duty structured in different ways and as part of a, if you like, a wider strategy and tapestry for the housing market. But in terms of this belief that you can somehow direct the market to behave in the way that you want and score some political gain from doing so, I think is entirely misconstrued, and particularly with the stamp duty cut post-pandemic, I just cannot see how in any way that was either that was justified at the time, especially as parts of the UK the stamp duty holiday also applied to investors or second home purchasers.
Yeah.
Actually overrode and negated some of the benefits that had been carefully put in place for would-be first-time buyers.
Yeah, and so much of this comes back to the fact that we don't necessarily have a kind of long-term housing strategy in this country, do we? So there's lots of little levers you can pull, short-term fixes and impacts, but a lot of unintended consequences. So coming back to the point that you made earlier, Peter, around actually quite often stamp duty cuts inflate prices in the market, so not really helping the people that might be set out to help. Do you think we're now looking at then, danger of rapid rise in arrears and repossessions? There's certainly a lot of speculation around what that might mean for some of those perhaps more vulnerable recent first-time buyers.
I mean, clearly there will be some individual cases, but I personally think that the benefit of the Bank of England imposed stress test, the 3% stress test on the affordability assessment that lenders undertake, does mean that, as Bob has already said, it's moved the threshold up as to who can afford to enter home ownership. It does mean that all of recent buyers over the last few years have been assessed about their ability to pay 3% extra on their mortgage rate. Now, although the bank has now withdrawn the stress test, actually the market has not. The market continues to operate cautiously, reflecting entirely, Rachel, the concerns that you're expressing, that there is in a rising rate environment, there's inevitably a risk of rising arrears and possessions. But what the stress test still being in place means is that those checks continue to be in place. And actually, it should mean that whatever difficulties the market as a whole faces, relatively few first-time buyers should face long-term arrears leading to repossessions. And I think the other thing to say on the back of that is not just the stress test that's been imposed, but also a lot more lender activity around forbearance and supporting borrowers. The requirements, the regulatory requirements around supporting borrowers in difficulty are now much more significant and substantial than they were in previous downturns. That actually obliges lenders to be much more active in terms of, for example, switching in terms of products, potentially switching even reduced rates, but basically undergoing a variety of things that work with you as an individual borrower to help you work through the period of difficulty. Now, clearly there will be difficulties. I mean, if we go back to reflect on the fact that a vast majority of house purchase first-time buyers is based on two incomes. And of course, if we have a recession, it's almost certainly the case that one of those two incomes may be suffering in some way, whether it's reduced earnings or no earnings. So, there will be pressures that come through from a market downturn and indeed from rising rates. But I don't think the cataclysmic views of the housing market really stand up to close examination. I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture here. I'm trying to offer an objective assessment that I think some of the positive aspects I've described counteract some of the negative aspects that other people describe.
That's helpful, and reflect some of the learning from previous crises as well, which is important. Yeah. Yep. John, did you want to come in there?
It just occurred to me, Peter, that in the last 5-8 years, we've kind of shifted the insecurity in the housing market away from the owner-occupied sector into the private rented sector, haven't we? And also, while the stress tests and so on keep people out of the market who can't afford to buy, many of those people are in the private rented sector and will be under pressure in the private rented sector because of increasing rents.
I think that's a really good point, John. I mean, what we've done obviously is grown a much bigger private rented sector with many more people in it who are would-be first-time buyers who are, if you like, queuing up. Now, the estimates, there are very speculative estimates of how many there are. I've seen figures up to 2 million waiting, if you like, in the queue. And as you say, the pressures on them through rising rents and therefore eroding deposit capacity does mean politically the government has got a real issue here about the ladder between renting and owning. And I know it's a topic we're going to come on to, but I mean that issue of thinking across tenures is something that governments and indeed analysts spend too little time thinking about. They spend all their time worrying about individual tenures, but not the linkages between them.
So, well, that's a good segue, I think, Peter, into talking about the private rented market, which, as you rightly say, doesn't get as much attention as it should. And in recent years, politically, it started to rise up the agenda, looking at, quality and so on. But actually, the issue of affordability is not going to be addressed by some of the legislation coming. And as we've seen, there was coverage just over the weekend of some really quite extortionate increases in private rents, and obviously reflecting of increasing mortgage rates for buy-to-let landlords, but also just the contraction in the market. That means there's clearly a supply and demand imbalance. What are your thoughts on where that's going to go, and what, if anything, can the Chancellor be doing about that in the autumn statement this week?
I'll be brief, and Bob will know I want to join in on this. I mean, we have to remember, I think about half of landlords don't have a mortgage. So it does, although rate rises are impacting on some landlords, they're certainly not impacting on all landlords. And clearly we've seen a shift in the way ownership patterns within the private rented sector have gone, with more corporate landlords emerging in the marketplace, and to some extent a slight diminution in the number of individual landlords. And we do hear very gloomy tales about landlords selling up and getting out, again, which puts pressure on rents and supply. Although I think there's some risk that inevitably, if I was a landlord and asked, what am I going to do in a survey that's trying to paint a gloomy picture of landlords, I'm going to say, I'm exiting tomorrow. The question, of course, is, will I exit tomorrow? And if I did, where would I put the money that I've got from the exit? And of course, also, is there somebody willing to buy what I'm about to try and sell? So I think the dynamics of the PRS are quite complicated and bear much more scrutiny than they receive. So I think we do have issues around how we view the private rent sector. The regulatory pressures, Rachel, that you touched upon, are clearly coming through. The costs of being a landlord are going up for all sorts of reasons, not because of our mortgages, but other environmental issues, standards that they need to maintain, which are very important and very necessary they go through. But of course, it's allowed the PRS to develop this narrative, which is very much we're being victimized. And if you victimize us, then you also victimize all of those would-be first-time buyers in the sector. So the politics of the PRS are becoming really complex around this battleground of where people are able to house themselves and where their future housing might be found. So I think we've got some real challenges here. That the only government scheme that in theory addresses this directly, which is a sort of rent to buy type scheme, doesn't even really have any systematic statistics on it. It's proved to be an absolutely non-existent vehicle to assist people to move from renting into owning for all sorts of good reasons when you look at the product. So the government itself, I think, has struggled to deal with this issue of the transition between renting and owning.
Yeah, and certainly it's moved from being a sort of younger person's tenure that politicians then didn't need to worry about too much to being something that is actually covering voters of all different ages and demographics. So the cynic in you at least can say politically it matters now in a way that it didn't before. Yeah. John, Bob.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I mean, I think it's very easily forgotten that the private rented sector provides this fantastic shock absorber for the housing market, both those hoping to move into home ownership and also those who, for a variety of reasons, need to step out of the housing market. And of course, it's much bigger in scale than it was 15, 20 years ago. But the thing that worries me is that government and lots of commentators don't really show a very sensitive understanding of the private rented sector. Too often we either impose changes on landlords in the private rented sector, or we impose restrictions and regulations without necessarily even asking landlords what the impacts might be. So, I mean, a classic case, which is probably outside the remit of most of what we're going to talk about, but in terms of the energy efficiency of the housing stock, you know, we have seen government debate and seek to impose much more stringent energy performance certificate requirements on landlords, and indeed going forwards perhaps restrict their ability to rent properties if they fail to meet a certain standard. Thought process behind that, or the assumption behind that on the government's part, is that landlords have deep pockets and therefore will finance this, and there'll be a gradual recovery of costs through higher rent over the long term. But some of the reality seems to be that landlords are choosing to dispose of their properties which fall foul of incoming EPC requirements. Those properties are expensive to remediate. Who in the home ownership sector is going to take those on? I guess the properties will be picked up by first-time buyers, but it is not really easily dealing with the issue. And if the end result of government policy is some reduction in the availability of rental property, And that's also coming at a time when would-be first-time buyers are struggling to put together the finances to purchase, or reluctant to step forward and purchase during a very uncertain period for the economy and for their jobs. Demand for rental properties is increasing at potentially at the same time that supply is under pressure. The result, of course, is higher rents, and the whole thing doesn't really add up. And I think part of it is we've never had that mature, joined up conversation about what the role of the private rented sector is and how to get the most from that and make sure that we have a housing market that shows easy movements in and between tenures.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the private renting market is picking up the high end and the bottom end, isn't it? It's picking up people that would traditionally have been housed in social housing, which, as we all know, is severely lacking. And then we're seeing more and more taxpayers' money going into subsidising rents in what can often be quite poor quality housing that's leaking energy as people sort of pay high rents to sit in cold properties through the winter. So yeah, really challenging. John, do you want to come in on that?
It just occurred to me that I mean, Bob's interesting point about energy efficiency highlights the fact that we brought in yet another big government body into the picture, haven't we? The housing market has traditionally been overseen by a sort of uneasy alliance between what's now the Department of Levelling Up and the Treasury. We're probably on the home ownership side, the Treasury playing the predominant role. And now we've got the business ministry and its energy responsibilities in the fray. And so, you know, policy making is even less joined up. And in so many different respects, we're trying to take an holistic view of the housing market, but the government is failing to do so.
So there's some huge challenges for policymakers, aren't there, for the officials sitting in Treasury and Department for Levelling Up and so on, trying to work out what all of this means for different people at different stages of their life, on or off the property ladder.
And I think sorry, Rachel, just on that, forgive me for interrupting, but I mean, on that, inevitably with the turnover of civil servants and the lack of historical record within the civil service of what they've tried in the past and what's worked and failed, they are ill-equipped many times to actually do that work.
And the turnover in housing ministers, of course, our fifth this year. Here we are in November and it's our fifth already. So the political seesaw doesn't help, does it?
No.
So thinking ahead then, I'm sure Jeremy Hunt's a busy man and he's probably not going to have time to listen to this podcast before Thursday. But if you had his ear or the ears of officials thinking about, well, what could you do that would make a difference, a good difference, as you think about the autumn statement, what do you think that he should be doing?
Shall I, Bob, do you want to start?
Yeah, happy to. I'm going to come at this a slightly different way. For me, actually, I would like Jeremy Hunt to be focused on matters which are entirely not the housing market. I think he's got one job on Thursday, and that's to restore fiscal credibility in the fairest way possible. I don't see the housing market as being a primary target for measures on Thursday, and nor should it be. And I think in that context, I think doing nothing with respect to the housing market is okay. Too often we've had very short-termist, knee-jerk measures, sometimes very populist measures. I think it wouldn't be a bad thing, given that we are going to see a housing market that goes through a challenging adjustment period, one that hopefully is measured in months rather than years, that it wouldn't be a bad idea just for the housing market to begin to settle and absorb what's happening, to recognise that government for the foreseeable future will not have the long pockets that it can use to throw endless resource at trying to address housing market issues, and actually just encourage a much stronger dialogue across the industry as to what are the issues that need addressing in a long-term fashion. And actually, maybe this creates a window for the industry to think about what that longer-term strategy might be, and to encourage government to think about the market longer term and develop policies that have a good chance of cross-party support.
And if I may follow on from that, I absolutely echo Bob's view that in many ways this is a budget about credibility of the UK economy and UK governance, and that has to be the central part. Of course, the Prime Minister has himself talked about helping mortgage borrowers, because finally, once we got through the noise around trust economics, and the idea that the trust regime had saved everybody by dealing with energy costs, rather forgetting quickly that they'd in the same breath put up mortgage costs, that the new Prime Minister has stepped forward and said that he intends to help mortgage borrowers. Now, the most obvious way that the Chancellor and indeed the Prime Minister can rationalise that without throwing tons of money at it is to do exactly what Bob has said, which is calm markets and help rates stabilise. And that process is underway. Assuming the autumn statement lands well, that process should continue. So I think in that sense, they can stand back and say, we are helping mortgage borrowers in the way we intended to. However, there are some specific measures that will come through the autumn statement that we should at least pay some attention to. I mean, the squeeze on budgets from DLUHC could have obviously an impact on the affordable housing programme. And I think everything we've said so far on this podcast would suggest that has consequences, and not least around shared ownership, for example. We've obviously got the closure of Help to Buy now underway. Last applications were in at the end of last month, and so that's now in rundown. Obviously, one option the Chancellor could, I suppose, jump to would be to reopen the door for Help to Buy as a palliative that some people may see as appropriate. I'm hoping they don't. I had to have a programme like that in place since 2013. A decade is an incredibly long short-term intervention in the housing market, where many of the benefits are passed to, which were always intended to pass to house builders to stabilise the house building industry. We don't need to stabilise the house building industry now, and therefore part of the rationale for Help to Buy is not there. So reopening Help to Buy, I think, would be a retrograde step, but it must be a political possibility. Equally, Boris Johnson, you may remember him, he was a previous Prime Minister. He announced a review of the mortgage market. That review of the mortgage market has been sort of lurking in the undergrowth for some months now. It supposedly is underway, but I think is not really progressing. And I think rightly, everybody needs to take a breath while the measures that Bob's talking about bring stability, and that whole thing about everybody taking stock about what might be needed really needs to be reflected upon when everything else is settled. We do have the new stamp duty thresholds. I suppose there could be some playing around with those, but I hope what Bob and I have already said would suggest that further playing around with stamp duty would be a very retrograde step. I mean, the savings that they're making by the cuts, or the savings that borrowers are making by the cuts, about 1.6 billion. So cutting the stamp duty changes wouldn't have a dramatic impact, but maybe again the Chancellor is scratching around to find 2 billion here and 2 billion there, which you know make it tempting. Who knows? We've mounted the arguments about why he should, but I suspect, as you've already said, he won't be listening. So I think the autumn statement is very significant in all sorts of ways, very generally in terms of the economy as a whole, and then specifically in terms of what it might mean for housing. But we don't want any new extra measures to assist the housing market.
Well, interesting. Let's hope some of the right people are listening to this. So, conscious of time, I think we could go on all day. There are so many other questions I would like to ask you, but I'm conscious of time and for people who may run out of patience in listening to us. So if I can just draw it to a close with a final question. So let's assume we get the stabilisation that we're hoping for at the autumn statement on Thursday. Looking ahead then to 2023, 2024, perhaps ahead of the next election, would you say on balance you feel optimistic as you look ahead at the forecast? We said we started out the podcast with, is there a glimmer of hope or is it all doom and gloom?
Well, it's not all doom and gloom, and I don't agree with the doomsters on this. However, the objective evidence is there quite strongly in sorts of ways. If you look at the most recent Treasury summary of independent forecasts, we've only got to contrast the sort of median view that the market had of the housing market to the end of this year with the view for 2023, where the median is for 0% house price inflation from comparing Q4 this year to Q4 next year. And even the OBR is forecasting only 0.8% rise in house prices. So the housing market, regardless of our views, by the analysts in the market, are assuming that the housing market is going to be close to negative, if not in negative territory. And certainly all of the price indices are showing steady edging down. But of course, the thing I think that Bob touched upon right at the outset is that actually the housing market performed more strongly than many people anticipated, even in 2022. And I think what that flags up is the fact that for all sorts of reasons, some people have to move and transact, and other people are still relatively unaffected by any of the things we've been describing, and they can move and transact. So actually, there are still people out there buying and selling. The numbers may come down, the prices may edge down, but the idea that there'd be a cataclysmic collapse of the housing market, I think is unrealistic. Now, some of this does turn on what happens to interest rates. I think everybody recognizes that when interest rates go up, there is quite a lagged effect before they impact on the housing market, at least a quarter before they really start to impact on demand and on pricing. So as interest rates edge up, we can see that downward pressure on the housing market. We've seen that working through over the last few months, and that's clearly bringing down the rate of increase. And now, of course, the rate of increase in nominal prices, those prices we actually see in the market, as opposed to real prices, which ironically the economists call real prices, the ones that we don't see, taking account of inflation. Those are both edging in towards negative territory. Nominal prices perhaps coming down to 7-6% on an annual basis, and inflation running at 10. So we're already into real house price falls, and nominally we're slipping down towards those next year being close to zero, and therefore will they definitely be in real house price falls. Now that's not going to affect many people that much. It obviously helps people coming into the market, albeit that why would you buy when prices are falling? And so you inevitably get the tension that if prices are falling, more people wait as opposed to jump in. It's a good time, because they might always be lower. So there's this sort of game that will go on as we enter into next year. I think we have to recognize that when it comes to the housing market, quite a lot of the commentary is done by vested interests. People have an interest in talking the market up, as it were, or at least not portraying it as negatively as perhaps it objectively should be. So we have to kind of weave our way through the market commentary to try and pick out what's real and what is hope. And I think, my sense of the market is we will still see some sort of very tiny nominal price gains, probably, because there will be some activity and there will be fewer transactions. So there will be some bargaining around what there is on the market. But we won't have the cataclysmic kind of collapse of house prices. Minus 20% would be cataclysmic. And if in nominal terms, that would be, I don't think the government would allow it to go there. I think the government would take the view that a housing market downturn will actually induce an economic downturn. And therefore, what you would see if house prices really started to go down, which has to be a possibility, I don't think it's a probability in the cataclysmic sense. I think government would step in. So I think for all those reasons and the underlying mismatch between demand and supply does mean that there are some basic props to the housing market as we go forward into 2023, but it certainly will be more negative than it was in 2022 and in 2021. So people will have to adjust their expectations.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And maybe, John, you might just help us end with a look ahead to how hopeful can we be in seeing some of this 300,000 homes per year in England that government committed to by the mid-2020s, which Michael Gove, as Secretary of State, kind of recommitted to recently, whilst acknowledging the many challenges around that. Because ultimately, you know, back to supply and demand, there are not enough homes being built for people now and those who will need them in the future. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, just first a quick thought on what Peter said. I mean, a very gradual fall in prices might be a good thing. At low, that may not be very welcome to the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, but it might be a good thing for the housing market. I think the worry about the 300,000 issue is twofold, isn't it? One is that, as ever, builders are going to be reluctant to build because they will only build when they see that they can sell their products at higher prices. And at the same time, if the affordable homes programme and the equivalents across the UK are left as they are, then affordable homes production should continue. But as Peter warned, we may see cuts there too. It's going to be difficult for them to cut the programme because a lot of the programme is now committed. But even a small cut, I think, would affect confidence. And sitting in the background, we've got this issue which we've discussed in other forums, which is rent increases in the social sector. If they're restrained or constrained heavily by government in order to help tenants' pockets, then of course this will damage investment in the sector. And one of the optional areas of expenditure, as it were, is new build, unfortunately, and it may be that new build and of course also decarbonisation of the housing stock will be one of the areas that suffers.
Well, perhaps we need another podcast after the autumn statement where we know we can stop talking about the hypotheticals and work with what we know. So I would love to bring Bob back in at this point and ask what he thinks, but unfortunately technology's got the better of us and we've lost him from our podcast. So we might have to wrap up at this point and invite Bob to join us again another day, because I'm sure he would have something to say on that. But can I thank you both, John and Peter, and Bob in his absence, for giving up your time to share your thoughts with us. So much there. We could have had any number of those things that we dived into as a whole topic in its own right, couldn't we? And I've certainly learned a lot from listening to you. We'll have to stop there, but thank you again.
Thank
and
you.
For those listening, you know, if you have heard stuff today that you'd like to dig into a bit more, a lot of what we've talked about is referenced in the UK Housing Review autumn briefing paper, with a lot more to follow in the more in-depth one that will come in the spring. So do look out for that. That's free for all CIH members. And we're very grateful to all the team that work on it and to the sponsors that support it. And we will be back shortly with another podcast. I'm not sure what it's on yet, but tune in and we will be back with another topic. And perhaps Peter, John and Bob, if you're happy to come and join us again, we can pick this up and explore it a bit more at a later date. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.